It started every morning, always the same way. As the first blue light crept up over the folds of Millstone Ridge, Dane would make his way out onto the frosted porch of the old ranger cabin, coffee mug in hand, breath steaming in the crisp air. Before he even unlocked the equipment shed or checked his weather map for trail inspections, he'd look up the slope, and there it was. That dog, that impossible ghost gray collie, motionless on the rim of the ridge, its thick fur ruffled by the mountain wind, its eyes locked on him. It never barked, never moved, never seemed to shiver, even on the coldest dawns. Sometimes its silhouette blurred against the pale sky, and Dane would wonder if he was just seeing things, a trick of light, a shadow tangled in the brambles. But every morning, there it was. Always the same spot, always watching. The locals called it shade, though no one quite remembered why. Maybe because it drifted silent as a shadow. Maybe because it was more rumors than reality. The story went that shade once belonged to a hiker, some college kid from Knoxville, eager, athletic, missing since the winter snows swallowed up the old hiking trails. There'd been searches, posters, even dogs brought in from the state capitol. Nothing, just traces, a broken compass, a blue knit cap. And then, after the thaw, shade began appearing. Dane didn't believe in ghosts, at least not the kind that wore fur and had golden eyes. Still, even he couldn't ignore how the collie's gaze made him uneasy. There was a patience in those eyes, almost judgmental, as if the dog was waiting for something, or someone. And truthfully, Dane wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the dog itself, or the way he'd started relying on its silent company. On days when the wind howled and the sky threatened storms, shade was there. On mornings when Dane's hands trembled as he laced his boots, remembering all the ways his life had come undone, shade was there. On the worst days, the dog's steady presence was the only thing anchoring him to this lonely outpost in the mountains. He'd tried approaching once. It was a gray Thursday, sky bruised with storm clouds, the smell of rain drifting up the hollows. Dane pocketed a chunk of old beef jerky, figuring it was worth a try. He hiked the switchbacks, boots crunching on brittle grass, keeping his eyes on the ridge as he climbed. The collie didn't flinch, not when Dane called out softly, "Hey there, boy, you lost?" Not when he held out the food, arm aching. The distance between them never closed. Shade simply stared, unblinking, until Dane's nerve broke and he turned away, feeling foolish. That evening, over canned chili and an old paperback by lantern light, Dane found himself turning the encounter over and over in his mind. Maybe the dog was a ghost. Maybe it was just waiting for its master. Maybe it was waiting for him. The line between man and animal, past and present, real and unreal, all of it blurred up here in the wild, where the rules of ordinary life seemed to dissolve with the morning mist. He asked about shade at the gas station in town one supply run. The old man behind the counter gave him a squint, spat into a coffee cup and said, "That collie ain't right. Best leave it be." When Dane pressed, the man just shrugged. Sometimes the ridge keeps things, memories, secrets, dogs. You ever hear it bark? Dane shook his head. The old man just grunted. Exactly. After that, Dane stopped asking. Instead, he started to wonder, was it really so strange to find comfort in the habits of a watching dog, even one as spectral as shade? Was it stranger to admit that sometimes the thought of those eyes on him, steady, unjudging, was less lonely than the silence he carried inside himself? He started talking to shade, not close, not bold, just from the porch or the trailhead or through the window when the snow fell, thick and slow. Little things. "Morning, shade. Gonna rain, you know." Or, "I saw bear tracks down by the creek." Sometimes he just muttered whatever was in his mind, grateful for someone, anything that might listen. Winter melted into spring, spring baked into the pale gold of mountain summer, and still shade watched. No one else in the world seemed to notice. Hikers came and went, kids threw stones into the river, the park manager called to check in once a week. But for Dane, every dawn began and ended with the collie on the ridge, silent and unblinking. He knew, in some corner of his mind, that this was not how he was supposed to live. He'd been a different man once, a respected scientist, a fighter for the truth, a husband, a son. Now he was just a shadow, in a ranger's uniform, haunted by a dog in his own memories, treading the same trails day after day, pretending that the wilderness could wipe the past clean. But even as he told himself it didn't matter, that the dog was just a quirk of the mountains, he couldn't shake the sense that something was coming, that this silent watcher on the ridge was not just a relic of loss, but a harbinger of change. Some days the feeling clawed at him so fiercely that he almost called his old number, almost reached out to the world he'd left behind. He never did. Instead, he watched Shade, and Shade watched him. And in that uneasy, wordless truce, the days rolled on, the boundaries between loneliness and connection shifting just enough to keep Dane hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way back to himself. There are moments when the world seems to press in on all sides, when the cold wind whips through the pines and rattles the tin roof of the ranger cabin, and Dane finds himself standing at the edge of the porch, coffee gone cold in his hands, lost in thoughts that never really leave him. The mountains are quiet, but his memories are not. Every sound, the distant call of a hawk, the crackle of dry branches, even the soft crunch of Shade's paws somewhere far up the ridge, draws him back to a different life, one he sometimes wishes he could forget. He hadn't always been Ranger Dane, not out here anyway. Once, not that long ago, he was Dr. Dane Atwood, environmental biologist, respected researcher, conference speaker. He wore pressed shirts and carried a leather briefcase, kept awards lined up like sentinels on his Atlanta office wall. He had friends, or so he thought. A wife who wore her hair in a tight bun and believed in dinner parties. A father who quoted Thoreau and never missed a city council meeting. Dane was the son everyone pointed to at holiday gatherings, the golden boy, who made his parents proud. He'd believed in the work, too. He believed science could make a difference, that the world could change if only people listened. Maybe that's why he hadn't kept his head down, hadn't looked the other way when the reports started crossing his desk. Elevated lead levels in the Chattahoochee, dead trout washing up downstream, test wells showing chemicals that had no business anywhere near a water supply. The numbers didn't lie. Someone was dumping something, and it wasn't by accident. At first, Dane tried to follow the rules. He filed his complaints through official channels, sent polite but pointed emails to the company responsible, even tried to set up a meeting with his own boss to talk about the data. Each time the doors closed a little more. Calls went unanswered. Colleagues who used to smile at him in the break room started looking away. His wife grew silent at the dinner table, her face drawn, her fingers fidgeting with her wedding band. But Dane didn't stop. He pushed harder, wrote up his findings, attached the water samples, copied half the city's environmental board on his email. And then, because he couldn't stand the silence any longer, he went to the press. The story broke big, front-page headlines, TV cameras on the steps of his office building. For a moment, it looked like he'd done it. The plant managers gave interviews. The city promised investigations. And then, like a bad dream, it all fell apart. Suddenly, new data surfaced. Data that contradicted his findings, that cast doubt on his methods. The company released statements, hired high-priced lawyers, whispered about rogue employees, and misinterpreted results. His boss, red-faced and trembling, called him in for a meeting and handed him a letter. Administrative leave, pending review. The media circus turned, and just like that, he was painted as a fanatic. Someone who let passion blind him to the facts. His friends distanced themselves, one by one, until their silence was as sharp as betrayal. His wife packed her bags one night, leaving a note on the counter. "I can't do this anymore." His father didn't call, not once, For weeks, Dane drifted in a haze, box of belongings under one arm, resume in the other. But the doors that had once swung open now stayed firmly shut. No one wanted to hire a troublemaker. No one wanted to talk to the man who'd become a warning story in staff meetings. "Don't end up like him," he imagined them saying. He let his principles get in the way of his career. He lasted 3 months in Atlanta, haunting coffee shops, checking job postings. But every time he looked in the mirror, he saw not just a man who had lost everything, but a man who had lost himself. The city's lights, once comforting, felt harsh and exposing. The friends he'd had now crossed the street to avoid him. He realized, slowly and painfully, that there was nothing left for him there. So, when a listing for a remote ranger position in the Great Smoky Mountains appeared, low pay, long hours, solitude required, Dane didn't think twice. He packed what little he had, sold the rest, and drove north, letting the roads wind higher and higher until the city faded away and all that was left was forest and sky. Here, in the wild, nobody cared about his past. Nobody recognized his name. The other rangers kept to their own stations. The locals barely spoke above a nod. It was a place built for hiding, and at first that suited him just fine. But solitude is its own kind of reckoning. There are no distractions in the mountains, no meetings, no traffic, no endless scroll of emails to drown out the ache of regret. Instead, there are long days spent hiking muddy trails, hauling firewood, patching leaky windows. There are long nights, too, when the wind rattles the cabin and every shadow seems to flicker with memory. Dane tried to build a routine, patrol at dawn, inventory supplies, inspect the visitor center, even when no visitors ever came. Sometimes, he volunteered for the hardest jobs, repainting faded trail markers, cleaning out blocked culverts, mapping storm damage after every wild thunderstorm. The labor hurt, but it was a clean pain, a pain that belonged to the present. But it didn't matter how many miles he walked or how many cabins he repaired. The past trailed him like a wounded limb, heavy and unavoidable. Every time his phone buzzed, a rare event given the spotty service, he half expected it to be Atlanta, as someone saying it had all been a mistake. It never was. He didn't talk about any of it. Not to the park manager, not to the store clerk in town, not to the volunteers who came by twice a year for maintenance. In the end, the only one who ever really listened was Shade, the collie on the ridge, silent and steadfast, always there, always watching. Sometimes, Dane wondered if the dog could see right through him, past the ranger uniform and the new life, straight into the cracks he tried so hard to hide. Maybe that was why he kept looking for Shade, day after day. Maybe he needed to believe in something that wouldn't turn away, that wouldn't disappear when the truth got hard. Or maybe, as the weeks slipped by and the seasons changed, he was just grateful for a witness, even if it was only a dog. Up here, among the ridges and mist, Dane had become a shadow of himself, but he was still standing. And every morning, when he saw Shade on the ridge, he felt a flicker of something like hope, a reminder that even in exile, even broken and alone, he was still alive, still watching, still waiting for whatever came next. Dane's days followed a pattern so steady it was almost ritual. Wake with the dawn, stretch against the stiff ache in his back, listen to the soft groan of the old cabin settling as sunlight touched the frost-misted windows. Sometimes he would watch the vapor from his breath drift in the cold air, lingering longer than it should, like everything else that hung around this lonely mountain. The Great Smoky Mountains had a way of pulling everything inward. Sound, secrets, memories, and, most of all, silence. Each morning, before the sun had fully cleared the trees, Dane walked his usual circuit. He would check the tool shed, scan the weathered bulletin board for vandalism or missing notices, and make his way to the trailhead. There, he would pause, eyes drifting up to the ridge, half expecting, no, hoping to spot the gray collie waiting, silent and watchful. And every morning, almost without fail, Shade was there, a spectral presence outlined against the trembling horizon. Their ritual was unspoken. Dane never called to the dog, at least not directly. He would mutter a greeting under his breath, or just nod, pretending not to care. But he cared. The truth was, Shade's presence grounded him in a way nothing else did. It was as if the dog was the only living creature who noticed that Dane still existed, that he occupied a place in the world. In the early months after his exile from Atlanta, when loneliness threatened to consume him, the collie's steady gaze was sometimes all that stood between him and despair. He tried, at first, to keep busy. The park's network of trails twisted through the dense woods like a tangle of veins, and there was always something to fix. A fallen signpost, a rusted bridge rail, a downed limb from the last thunderstorm. Dane threw himself into the work, scouring muddy creek beds for debris, repainting the faded blazes on trees, hauling bags of trash left by careless hikers. Every hour spent in labor dulled the memories of his old life, but only for a little while. At night, the silence pressed in again, and he'd find himself staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. In that silence, Shade became more than a mystery. He became a presence, a lifeline. Some days, when the air was still and cold, and Dane's only company was the sound of his own boots in the leaf litter, he would spot the dog trailing him from a distance, not close enough to touch or speak, but never quite letting him out of sight. Other times, he'd catch a flash of gray fur at the tree line as he rounded a bend, or see paw prints in the mud, fresh, unmistakable, leading just far enough ahead to keep the chase going. At first, Dane tried to ignore the collie. "He's not your dog," he would remind himself. "He's just lost." But with each passing week, the animal's quiet constancy began to eat away at his defenses. There was a strange comfort in the way Shade never judged, never turned away, never demanded anything. Even the locals, with all their superstitions, had stopped asking about the dog. "Some things belong to the ridge," they'd say, and leave it at that. Dane started talking to Shade more often. Not real conversations, just fragments, as if speaking to the wind. He'd narrate his work. "Trails washed out down by Copper Run. Ought to fix that before the weekend crowd shows up." Or, on quiet afternoons, he'd recount the headlines from his radio, stories about distant cities that felt less and less real the longer he stayed on the mountain. Sometimes, if he was feeling particularly reckless, he'd tell the dog things he'd never admit to another soul. "I don't know if I'll ever go back." "Not sure I want to." Shade, of course, never replied, but his silence was not empty. There were moments, fleeting, half-imagined, when Dane felt the dog's gaze cut right through him, seeing everything he tried so hard to hide. On those days, Dane would return to the cabin with a strange sense of relief, as if a burden had been shared without a word spoken. The seasons turned slowly. Spring brought floods and tangled underbrush, and with it, more work. Dane welcomed the labor, but the ache in his bones grew worse, and the nights seemed longer. Sometimes he dreamed of Atlanta, the glare of fluorescent lights, the endless rows of test tubes, his wife's cold goodbye. He woke with a gasp, sweat slick on his brow, and would sit in the dark until his heartbeat calmed. In those moments, he wondered if the mountains were healing him at all, or simply preserving what was left. Still, every day began and ended with Shade. Even on the worst mornings, when the radio forecasted rain, when the clouds clung low to the ridge and hid the world in swirling gray, Dane could count on the collie's outline in the distance. There were days when the dog disappeared for hours, and Dane felt an inexplicable panic, as if he'd lost something vital. But always by dusk, Shade would reappear, silent and patient, waiting as the sun sank behind the mountains. On some level, Dane began to think of the collie as a part of himself, a projection, maybe, a fragment of hope or forgiveness given physical form. He knew it was foolish, but he clung to it anyway. Everyone else from his old life had vanished, but Shade remained unwavering. In his darkest moments, Dane found comfort in that strange connection. Sometimes, as he lay in his bunk listening to the wind rattle the shutters, he would imagine what it would be like to call the dog close, to let him curl up by the fire, to have someone to share the silence with. But the distance remained. Shade never crossed it. Dane never forced it. Instead, they existed together, two exiles, bound by a silent understanding, the unspoken agreement that neither would ask too much of the other. The ridge belonged to both of them now, and, in a way, that was enough. As summer faded to fall and the first hints of frost appeared on the porch railings, Dane realized he was healing, slowly and quietly. The pain of his old life dulled, replaced by the rhythms of the mountain and the certainty of Shade's daily vigil. He still carried the weight of regret, but it was lighter now, shared with a silent companion who never judged and never left. He didn't know what the future held, whether the world beyond the mountains would ever let him return. But here, in the hush of the woods, with Shade watching from the ridge, Dane found something like peace. For the first time in a long while, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was not as alone as he'd always feared. The rhythms of mountain life had settled around Dane like a second skin. His world was measured in sunrises and sunsets, the creak of floorboards, the call of distant crows, and the silent watch of a gray collie. Shade's presence had become more than a curiosity. It was a comfort, an anchor, a mystery that never asked to be solved. Even on days when clouds clung low to the ridge and the woods filled with fog, Dane could always count on seeing the collie's silhouette standing guard in the distance. But it was a Tuesday in late October, one of those days when the wind carried a promise of frost and the forest burned with orange and gold, that everything began to change. Dane woke before the alarm, an uneasy pressure in his chest that felt like anticipation, though he couldn't have said what for. He dressed by the pale glow of the lantern, pulled on his thickest jacket, and stepped out into a world still holding its breath. The ridge was veiled in mist, dew clung to every blade of grass, and the sky above was just beginning to warm with the colors of dawn. He scanned the horizon almost without thinking, and there was Shade, standing at his usual spot, atop Millstone Ridge. The ritual began, as always. Dane poured his coffee, sat on the splintered porch step, and let the silence work its way into his bones. But as the minutes ticked by, something felt different. Shade wasn't watching him with his usual stillness. Instead, the collie's ears were pricked, his body taut, as if he were waiting for something more. Every few moments, the dog's gaze flicked away from Dane, down the slope, toward the tree line, then back to Dane again, sharp and insistent. Dane frowned, unsettled. He sipped his coffee and tried to ignore the sense that today, the routine would not be enough. It happened quickly. One moment, Shade was poised on the ridge, a living statue. The next, he turned, suddenly, purposefully, and padded away, along a faint animal trail that twisted into the trees. Dane's breath caught. He'd seen Shade vanish into the woods before, but never like this. This wasn't the slow, drifting departure of a wild creature losing interest. This was deliberate, calculated. And then, just as suddenly, Shade stopped. He turned his head, looked back, and waited. For a long moment, Dane just stood there, frozen between impulse and reason. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put. The rules of the park, the lessons of wilderness safety, all cautioned against wandering off the marked trails, especially this late in the year, with winter threatening at the edges of every shadow. But there was something in Shade's posture, something in those golden eyes, that spoke louder than logic. An invitation, or maybe a challenge. He set his coffee down, heart pounding. "Well, what do you want from me, boy?" he muttered. The words felt foolish, small in the vast silence of the forest. But Shade remained, motionless, patient. Against his better judgment, Dane pulled on his gloves and grabbed his flashlight from the porch. He hesitated, glancing back at the safety of the cabin. A tiny refuge in a world that suddenly felt much too big. Then, almost before he realized what he was doing, he found himself moving. Boots crunching over frosty grass, every sense tuned to the possibility of the unknown. Shade led the way, silent and swift, weaving between the trees with an ease that bordered on supernatural. Dane followed at a careful distance, heart thumping with every step. The path was unfamiliar, a narrow animal track that skirted boulders and wound through tangles of wild rhododendron. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and the sharp, earthy musk of decaying wood. As the forest deepened, the light faded and the trail grew treacherous. Twice, Dane nearly lost his footing on slick roots. Once, a startled deer crashed through the underbrush, vanishing before Dane could even catch his breath. Through it all, Shade never slowed, never looked back, except to make sure Dane was still following. Time stretched and tangled. Dane lost all sense of direction. He could have been walking north, south, or in circles for all he knew. The only constants were the collie's guiding figure ahead and the quiet hush of the forest around them. In the growing gloom, every shadow seemed to flicker with hidden meaning. Every branch felt like the arm of an old friend or the warning finger of something unseen. Dane's mind spun with questions. Why now? Why him? What was the dog trying to show him? He thought about the rumors, the missing hiker, the dog's strange loyalty, the stories the locals whispered over cheap beer in town. For the first time since arriving on Millstone Ridge, Dane realized he was afraid. Not just of getting lost, but of what he might find if he followed Shade all the way to the end. Eventually, the trees thinned, and they emerged onto a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. Dane paused, breathless, scanning the wild expanse below. Shade stopped at the edge, tail high, body quivering with tension. He looked back one final time, his gaze piercing and insistent. Dane stepped forward, his boots scraping against loose gravel. The view was spectacular. The valley stretched out in shades of green and gold, rivers winding like silver threads through the distant hills. But it wasn't the scenery that drew his attention. It was the sense of history, of something buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Shade let out a low whine, the first sound Dane had ever heard from him, and nosed at a patch of disturbed earth beneath a twisted pine. Dane's pulse quickened. He dropped to his knees, brushing aside pine needles and loose stones. Something glinted in the morning light. A piece of torn fabric, a rusted zipper, the corner of a weathered backpack. He froze, the reality of what he was seeing cutting through the haze of adrenaline. This wasn't just an invitation. It was a summons, to bear witness, to find what had been left behind. But that moment, that revelation, would wait for another day. For now, standing on the edge of the ridge with Shade by his side and the forest holding its breath, Dane felt a strange, fierce clarity. He didn't know where the path would lead or what ghosts he might find at the journey's end. But for the first time since exile had driven him to the mountains, he wasn't running away. He was moving forward, one uncertain step at a time, into the heart of the mystery. And maybe back toward himself. The hush of the forest thickened around Dane as he knelt beside Shade, every nerve alive with a prickling sense of anticipation and dread. For a moment, he simply stared at the patch of disturbed earth beneath the ancient pine, his breath catching in his throat. The ground here was churned and scattered, as if something or someone had clawed at it with desperate intent. The sun, now fully above the tree line, filtered through the needles in slanting golden beams, casting jagged shadows across the rocky ledge. With shaking hands, Dane brushed away more debris. First came a torn strip of backpack canvas, blue faded almost to gray. Next, a broken zipper, half buried in the loam. Shade hovered beside him, eyes fixed on the ground, tail still as stone. A chill snaked up Dane's spine. This was no ordinary lost hiker's stash. The remnants spoke of violence, of a struggle, of something unfinished. His breath fogged in the morning chill as he pried loose a lump of earth, revealing the rest of the backpack. Dane hesitated, the weight of his own memories crashing down. The lost jobs, the broken trust, the things buried in his own past that he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Now, he was facing something else buried, literally and figuratively, in these woods. With a surge of resolve, Dane pulled the pack free. It was battered, dirt-caked, the fabric torn at one corner as if it had snagged on a root or been dragged. Dane's gloved fingers fumbled at the zipper, which broke away entirely at his touch. He upended the contents onto the mossy earth. A water bottle, half crushed. A faded map of the Smokies, edges smeared and unreadable. A handful of protein bars, wrappers gnawed open by mice. Then, as his heart thudded dully in his ears, he found the ID. It was cracked, the plastic warped by months of sun and rain, but the picture was unmistakable. A young man, bright-eyed and smiling, with a name badge clipped below. Caleb Watterson, Knoxville. Dane's breath came sharp and shallow. The missing hiker. The story the locals told in half whispers, the one that had turned Shade into a legend. All this time, the clues had been waiting, hidden in plain sight. Dane turned the ID over in his hands, his mind racing. The authorities had called off the search months ago, convinced that no one could survive a winter alone on Millstone Ridge. There had been rumors, of course, of sightings, of strange noises in the night, but nothing concrete. And now, here it was, undeniable. Evidence, grim and silent, staring back at him from the palm of his hand. A sudden gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, showering Dane with brittle pine needles. Shade whined, low and anxious, pressing closer. Dane followed the dog's gaze and noticed something else. Dark stains on the rocks nearby. A patch of dried blood clinging stubbornly to the lichen. His stomach twisted. The realization hit hard. Whatever had happened here hadn't ended well. He forced himself to look away, to focus on the practical. He needed to mark the location, document what he'd found. With hands that trembled only slightly, Dane pulled out his park radio, flicked it on, and pressed the call button. Static crackled in response, sharp and abrasive. He tried again. Nothing but white noise. The radio screen blinked red, a signal lost to the thick curtain of forest and stone. Frustration built in Dane's chest. He was trained for emergencies. He knew the procedure. But the nearest ranger station was miles away, and without a working radio, he was cut off, alone with the truth of what he'd found and the questions it raised. Still, protocol was all he had. He used his phone to take photos of the backpack, the blood, the ID, marking the coordinates with a trembling finger. He recorded a voice memo describing the scene in as much detail as he could manage, his voice low and tense. Shade stayed close, pacing in small circles, never venturing far from Dane's side. There was something almost human in the dog's anxiety, a silent urgency that made Dane's own fear spike higher. He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the isolation pressing in. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the distant scent of snow, a reminder that winter could descend without warning. He looked at Shade. "What now, boy?" he whispered, the words wrenched from somewhere deep and raw. The collie only stared back, eyes luminous in the shifting light, as if urging Dane to act, to move, to do something. A memory surfaced, his days as an environmental biologist, standing before crowds with charts and data, the sense of purpose that had once fueled him. There was a time when the truth had meant everything, when he believed that shining a light on what was hidden could change the world. Here, in the wild heart of Millstone Ridge, the stakes were smaller but no less real. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to care. Resolved, Dane stuffed the evidence back into the torn pack, slung it over his shoulder, and rose to his feet. The blood on the rocks seemed darker now, the silence heavier. He scanned the trees, half expecting to see something, someone, watching from the shadows. But there was only shade, in the endless hush of the mountain. He started back the way he'd come, following the faint trail through the underbrush. Shade led the way, ears perked, body tense. The terrain was steeper than he remembered, the ground slick with frost. Every step felt precarious, as if the earth itself might give way at any moment. Dane's boots slipped on loose gravel, and he caught himself against a twisted branch, the shock jolting through his arms. The radio hissed in his pocket. Useless. Dane checked his phone. No bars, just a blinking SOS. Panic threatened, but he pushed it down, focusing on the rhythm of his breath, the weight of the backpack, the steady presence of shade ahead. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the light fading faster than it should, as if the mountain itself wanted to swallow their secret whole. When they finally broke through the last stand of pines, the sky was leaden, thick with the promise of snow. Dane felt exhaustion drag at his bones, but relief too, a sense that he had done what he could, that he had not turned away from the truth this time. He knelt beside Shade, reaching out to ruffle the collie's fur. "Good boy," he murmured, voice hoarse. For a moment, the two of them simply sat together, bound by the unspoken weight of what they had uncovered. Then, somewhere above, a crow cawed, a harsh, lonely sound, and the spell was broken. Dane stood, squared his shoulders, and began the slow, careful descent toward the ranger cabin, heart heavy with both fear and hope. Whatever happened next, he was not alone. And as the first snowflakes began to drift down through the trees, Dane understood that some mysteries refused to stay buried. Some ghosts would not let go, not until the truth was finally brought into the light. The sky was already turning an ominous steel gray when Dane began the trek back down from the ridge, the torn backpack heavy on his shoulders and Shade close at his heels. The discovery of Caleb's ID and the bloody remnants had left Dane shaken, but there was a new urgency burning through his veins. The world felt both too big and too close, trees pressing in, wind stinging his cheeks, the collie's presence suddenly more anxious than reassuring. He moved quickly, boots crunching on frost-hardened leaves, eyes flicking up to scan the sky every few steps. The air was changing, charged with electricity, and the temperature had dropped in the space of an hour. It was the kind of weather that could turn deadly on a dime, a lesson Dane had learned the hard way during his first season as a ranger. Here, in the Smokies, the mountain wrote its own rules, and anyone who ignored them did so at their peril. Shade darted ahead, circling back with each pause, as if urging him to hurry. "I know, boy," Dane muttered. "I'm moving." But the path was steeper than he remembered, slick with hidden patches of black ice and blanketed in a tangle of roots. The wind howled through the trees, sending bursts of icy sleet rattling down in a stinging cascade. Dane pulled his hood tight, squinting against the elements. Suddenly, the world went white. Snow and ice swirled in a blinding sheet. Driven by a gust so fierce, Dane had to dig in his heels just to keep from being blown backward. It was a blizzard, coming down fast and hard, obliterating landmarks and swallowing the faint trail they'd broken on the way up. Dane cursed under his breath. He'd known storms could blow up quick in October, but he'd never seen one hit with this kind of violence. He pressed on, fighting for every step, breath burning in his lungs. Shade became little more than a blur, a patch of gray fur flickering in and out of the white chaos. "Stay close," Dane shouted, his voice ripped away by the wind. But the collie seemed to understand, looping back again and again, never letting Dane out of sight. Visibility shrank to a few feet. Every tree looked the same, every dip in the land another trap waiting to twist an ankle or snap a bone. Dane tried to keep his bearings. There should have been a fallen log to the left, a narrow stone bridge over a gully to the right, but nothing looked familiar. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind. He stopped, tried his radio again, just static. His phone was useless, the screen blinking a cold, lifeless red. He had to keep moving. Hypothermia was a real threat now, the cold biting deep even through his layers. Dane's fingers grew numb, his legs heavy as lead. He hunched his shoulders and forged ahead, calling out for Shade every few minutes, the words lost to the screaming wind. Then, disaster struck. One moment, he was navigating a narrow stretch of trail that skirted a rocky ledge, boots searching for solid ground. The next, the earth vanished beneath him, an icy patch hidden under a drift of snow. Dane's feet shot out from under him. He pitched forward, arms flailing, the world spinning in a dizzying blur of white and gray. He slammed down hard, skidding over rock and ice. Pain exploded through his leg as he tumbled, ricocheting off a half-buried boulder. He came to a stop in a shallow ravine. The wind knocked out of him, snow filtering down through the branches above. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His thoughts scattered, the shock of impact blotting out everything but the raw animal need to survive. The pain in his right leg was, immediate and excruciating. Dane tried to sit up and gasped as agony shot up from his ankle to his thigh. No, 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 he muttered, clenching his jaw. He pressed his gloved hand to his shin and felt heat through the fabric, the unmistakable throb of swelling. Broken, or at least badly sprained. Panic surged again, sharper this time. He scrambled for his radio, thumbing the switch, desperate for a voice, any voice. Static. He fumbled with his phone, but the screen had gone black. Even the comforting bulk of the emergency beacon in his pack was gone, somewhere lost in the fall, maybe torn loose or wedged beneath the rocks. Snow continued to fall, heavier now. Dane's teeth began to chatter, his body shaking uncontrollably. He looked up, squinting through the swirling white, searching for shade. The dog was nowhere to be seen. "Shade!" he called, voice raw with fear. Only the wind answered, howling up the ravine. He tried to crawl, dragging himself across the frozen ground, but every movement sent lances of pain through his leg. Tears stung his eyes, part cold, part helpless fury. He couldn't die here. Not like this. Not when he'd just started to believe he could have a second chance, that the world might let him back in. The bitter irony of it hit him like another blow. He'd spent his whole life running from the ghosts of his past, only to be swallowed by the indifference of the wilderness. For a time, Dane drifted in and out of consciousness, battered by waves of cold and pain. Memories flickered at the edges of his mind. His father's disappointed face, the endless meetings in sterile boardrooms, the voice of his ex-wife saying, "You always cared more about the cause than about us." He remembered every mistake, every moment of doubt, every time he'd wondered if he was simply cursed to lose everything he loved. He lay in the snow, staring up at the blank sky, willing himself to move, to do something. But the cold was relentless, seeping into his bones, making even thought a struggle. The world narrowed to a pinprick, breath, pain, the roar of the storm, and somewhere, in the swirling white, the shape of a dog flickered in and out of vision. Real or imagined, Dane couldn't tell. He whispered, voice barely audible, "Are you real, Shade? Or just another ghost?" But there was no answer, only the blizzard, the pain, and the terrible, suffocating silence. Time lost all meaning. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. Dane knew the odds were against him. Even if the storm let up, he was miles from help, wounded and invisible beneath the thick canopy of snow-laden branches. He curled into himself, hugging his arms tight, eyes squeezed shut against the cold. If this was how it ended, he thought, maybe it was what he deserved. But even as darkness pressed in, some stubborn part of him refused to surrender. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on the simplest things, the pattern of his breath, the rise and fall of his chest, the distant hope that someone, something, might still be searching for him. As the blizzard raged on, Dane clung to that last fragile thread. Shade was out there, somewhere. Whether real or not, the thought of the collie's unwavering gaze gave him something to hold on to, a reason, however thin, to fight through the night. Snow piled relentlessly, the storm's fury beating Dane down with each passing minute. Pain pulsed through his shattered leg, sharp and unyielding, radiating up his body until it seemed to blur the boundaries between flesh and ice. Wind howled through the ravine, biting any exposed skin, and the world beyond the narrow hollow shrank to a numb, frozen blur. Dane tried to will himself up, to crawl, to shout for help, but each effort ended with him collapsed and shuddering, his voice vanishing in the blizzard's roar. Somewhere, above him, the gray shape of Shade appeared and disappeared, just out of reach, sometimes more shadow than dog. Dane wondered if the collie was truly there, or if his mind, battered by pain and cold, was conjuring comfort in its final hours. He reached for Shade, but only caught fistfuls of snow and pine needles. Time unspooled strangely in the storm, measured in agony and the steady fading of light. Dane clung to scraps of thought. He needed to stay awake, to keep his heart beating. He needed to find a way back to the trail. He needed to survive. But his body had other ideas. Shivers racked him, at first sharp and violent, then slowly fading to a dull tremor as the cold seeped deeper. His hands lost feeling. His face grew stiff, breathing hurt. Night fell fast, as it always did in the mountains. The whiteout around him turned to inky blue, and then to the featureless black of a winter's night, broken only by occasional flurries that whirled in the beam of his dying flashlight. As Dane's head drooped, his chin pressing to his chest. He felt the old urge to simply close his eyes and drift away. It would be easy. Just let go, let the snow blanket his mistakes and regrets. But the pain in his leg, merciless and raw, kept yanking him back. When it dulled, it terrified him even more. He rocked himself for warmth, gasping raggedly. "Don't go to sleep," he muttered, the words slurring, carried off by the wind. "Not yet." In the storm's chaos, memory came for him with the clarity of hallucination. Faces swirled out of the dark. His father, tall and distant, mouth set in a hard line, shaking his head at Dane's stubborn idealism. His mother's silence, the way she'd pressed a hand to her mouth and wouldn't meet his eyes when the news broke about his whistleblowing. The friends who had vanished, the colleagues who had cut him off. He remembered the last day at the office, the box of personal belongings, the echoing emptiness of a life coming apart. He remembered his wife, most of all, the way she'd wept silently while packing, the anger she couldn't put into words, the note she left behind, so measured and gentle. It hurt more than any accusation. "I can't do this anymore." He replayed her voice in his mind, over and over, wondering if there was anything he could have said to keep her there, to keep his world intact. But there wasn't. He'd lost everything because he'd told the truth, and the truth had left him more alone than he'd ever thought possible. His bitterness spilled out into the snow, hot and sharp. "You all turned your backs on me," he rasped, "when I needed you most." He pounded the ground with a frozen fist, barely feeling the pain. For the first time in years, Dane cried. He sobbed quietly, the tears freezing almost as soon as they fell, his shoulders racked by grief, frustration, and exhaustion. There was no one left to see him broken, no one except the storm, and maybe the ghostly dog that haunted his exile. It was both relief and agony to finally let go, to stop pretending he was still the man he'd once been. Sometime in the dead of night, when even the wind seemed to run out of rage, Dane whispered to the sky. His voice was weak and brittle. "You win. I give up. I can't do it anymore. I'm sorry." He let his head fall back and stared at the churning snow-dark clouds above. Surrender tasted bitter, but strangely peaceful. He was tired, so tired, all the fighting, all the running, all the years spent clinging to a stubborn sense of purpose that had brought him nothing but ruin. Maybe this was how it was meant to end. The mountains erasing his story, the snow covering up the scars. For a moment he almost slipped away. The cold became soft, a gentle fog wrapping around his senses. The pain in his leg faded to nothing. He saw himself, not as he was, but as he wanted to be. A man at peace. Forgiven. Understood. He felt the warmth of his mother's hug, heard his wife's laughter, imagined his father's approval. He almost believed it was real. But somewhere at the edge of consciousness, a sound pierced the numbness. A faint whimper, a nose pressed gently to his cheek. Dane opened his eyes in a daze and saw the blurry outline of Shade standing over him, eyes burning gold in the darkness. He didn't know if the collie was real or if this was just another kindness conjured by his dying mind. But the dog's presence stirred something primal, a flicker of hope that refused to die. Shade nosed Dane's chest, then circled him, pressing close, offering warmth and reassurance. In that moment, Dane realized that he didn't want to die. Not here, not alone, not with so much left undone. With the last scraps of will, he wrapped an arm around Shade, burying his face in the dog's rough fur. The animal lay beside him, sharing warmth, anchoring him to the present. Okay, Dane whispered. Just, a little longer. I'll try. He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in defiance, clutching that thread of hope as tightly as he could. The storm might have broken him, the world might have forgotten him, but he was still here, is still breathing, still fighting, if only for another hour. And somewhere, deep in the howling dark, the first hint of dawn waited to break, promising that maybe, just maybe, the night would not last forever. Somewhere between darkness and waking, Dane drifted in a half-world of pain and memory. Barely tethered to the snowbound hollow where his body lay. Sounds came in muffled waves, the groan of the wind, the soft hiss of falling snow, his own ragged breathing. At the edge of consciousness, he sensed movement, a gentle presence beside him, warm and real, like a candle flickering against the void. Dane forced his eyes open. The world was washed in pale blue, the storm's violence spent but the cold just as brutal. For a moment he thought he was alone, but then, out of the swirling mist, shade materialized. Solid, alive, his thick coat dusted with snow. The collie moved with purpose, no longer a phantom drifting at the edge of sight, but a companion, intent on saving a life. Shade pressed close, his breath visible in the dawn chill, golden eyes fixed on Dane with a fierceness that demanded attention. Between his teeth, he carried a familiar bundle, a battered medkit, the one Dane had lost during his fall. The sight of it, absurd and miraculous, jolted something loose inside Dane, a surge of desperate gratitude. With numb, clumsy fingers, Dane reached for the kit. Shade set it gently beside him, then lay down against Dane's side, sharing body warmth through the layers of ice-crusted clothing. Dane fumbled with the zipper, his hands shaking violently, but the dog stayed still, as if understanding that this was no ordinary morning. This was survival. Inside the kit, mercifully intact, was a space blanket, a few chemical hand warmers, and the remains of a first aid kit. Dane managed to wrap the silver blanket around his shoulders, the material crinkling as he pulled it close. The warmth was minimal, but it was hope, a fragile spark refusing to die. He opened the hand warmers, stuffing them inside his gloves and pressing them against his chest. Then, with a hiss of pain, he dug through the supplies for painkillers and dry gauze. His leg throbbed, ugly and swollen, but he managed to splint it with a makeshift brace from a broken branch, teeth clenched against the agony. Shade watched him work, head cocked, every muscle tense as if ready to spring at any threat. Dane's mind buzzed with fear and adrenaline. He had to keep moving, had to fight the cold that pressed in from every side. Shade seemed to sense the urgency. When Dane finished wrapping his leg, the collie stood, stretched, and nudged him gently, and then padded a few paces away and turned, looking back with unmistakable intent. Dane understood. Shade wanted him to follow. It was madness, maybe. Every nerve screamed for him to stay still, to conserve what little energy he had left. But the dog's gaze cut through his doubt, pulling him forward with a silent promise that hope was not lost. Dane bit down on his pain, propped himself up on his elbows, and began the crawl. He gritted his teeth, using his good leg to push and drag himself across the frozen ground. The world shrank to a narrow tunnel of effort. Each movement sent fresh jolts of pain through his body, but he focused on Shade, on the steady encouragement in the dog's posture, on the flick of a tail that signaled, "Keep going." The wind had died down, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of ice and the sound of Dane's ragged breathing. He crawled, inch by inch, Shade always just ahead, never letting the distance widen too far. As they moved, the forest changed. Dawn was seeping into the world, painting the snow with faint gold and pink. Dane could see the damage left by the storm, drifts piled high against the trunks, branches snapped and tangled, animal tracks veering wildly where creatures had sought shelter, but he barely registered the scenery. All that mattered was Shade, the lifeline dragging him out of despair. At one point, they reached a fallen log blocking the way. Dane collapsed against it, panting, his strength fading. Shade circled back, whining softly, pressing his nose against Dane's shoulder as if to say, "Don't stop!" With a growl of determination, Dane hauled himself over the obstacle, the effort nearly blacking him out. When he landed hard on the other side, Shade stood waiting, tail wagging once, just enough to let Dane know he wasn't alone. The sun climbed higher, and with it, Dane's hope flickered. He lost track of time, measuring progress in breaths and heartbeats. When exhaustion threatened to win, he would lock eyes with Shade. Let the dog's stubborn will carry him forward another foot, another yard. His world became a blur of snow, pain, and the unbreakable tether between man and dog. Eventually, they reached a small stand of pines where the snow thinned, revealing patches of bare earth and crushed leaves. Shade stopped here, standing alert, and looked back once more. Dane collapsed against a tree, breath coming in sharp, painful bursts. His leg burned, but his mind was clearing. He realized with a jolt that they were close to the spot where he first lost his radio, close to where the fall had begun. Shade began to dig, paws sending up showers of snow and dirt. After a few frantic moments, the dog uncovered something half buried, the bright orange casing of Dane's emergency radio, tossed aside in the chaos of the blizzard. Dane's heart leapt. With shaking hands, he snatched it up, flipped the switch, and listened. Static at first, then, faint and wavering, a human voice crackled through. Hope surged, sharp and exhilarating. He pressed the call button, slurring words of distress and coordinates, praying the signal would hold. Shade stood beside him, chest heaving, as if he too understood that this was the turning point. That rescue, finally, was within reach. As the first rays of true sunlight broke over the ridge, Dane let his head fall back against the trunk. He was battered, broken, half frozen, but alive. Shade curled against him, the warmth and weight of the dog a comfort deeper than words. In the silence that followed, Dane whispered, "You saved my life, boy." His voice trembled, raw with gratitude. "I won't forget it. Not ever." Together, they waited. Man and dog, survivors in a world that had done its best to break them. And as the light grew stronger and the sound of distant engines echoed through the mountains, Dane allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, to believe that maybe the world wasn't finished with him after all. The radio, clutched in his shaking hands, sputtered to life, each faint burst of static a lifeline in the cold mountain air. Dane forced himself upright, heart hammering as he listened for a sign, any sign, that his desperate call had been heard. Shade sat beside him, his breath puffing white in the sunlight, eyes still bright with intent. It was as if the dog understood that their journey wasn't over yet. Dane pressed the transmit button again. "This is Ranger Atwood. Need immediate assistance. Possible injured party. Coordinates." His voice trembled with exhaustion and pain, but he forced himself to be clear. A faint reply finally came back, warped by distance but unmistakable. "Copy that, Ranger. Hang tight. Help is on the way. Can you move to an open area for extraction?" Relief flooded through him, hot and dizzying. He leaned back against the tree, every muscle screaming in protest. Shade whined and nudged him with his nose, urging him forward once more. But the collie wasn't looking toward the sound of distant engines or the promise of rescue. He was facing a dense cluster of rocks and shattered timber nearby, his tail straight and rigid. Dane followed the dog's gaze, confusion prickling at the edge of his mind. Was there something else here? Shade barked, a sharp, urgent sound that Dane had never heard from him before, then darted toward a collapsed outcrop just beyond the stand of pines. Something in the dog's insistence roused Dane from his stupor. He grit his teeth, braced himself on a fallen branch, and dragged his battered body after Shade. The world narrowed to the struggle of movement, the scraping pain of his splinted leg, and the single-minded focus in Shade's every step. The dog circled a pile of tangled brush and stone, whining, then pawed frantically at a pocket of darkness beneath the largest slab. Dane crawled closer, his heart thundering with new anxiety. "Is someone there?" he called, voice raw. A faint sound, a shuddering gasp, floated up from beneath the rubble. It was so soft Dane almost missed it. Shade pawed again, tail wagging with wild hope. "Hold on," Dane shouted, adrenaline surging. He scraped away branches and loose rock with his bare hands, working past the agony in his leg, driven by a desperate sense of urgency. After what felt like an eternity, his fingers closed around cold, damp fabric, a sleeve. Dane froze, then pulled gently. With Shade's help, he managed to uncover the battered form of a young man wedged beneath the outcrop, half buried by a fall of debris. The man's face was gaunt and smeared with blood, his lips cracked, eyes blinking in the sudden light. "Help!" the hiker croaked. Relief and horror tangled in Dane's chest. "You're alive. You're safe now," he breathed, tears stinging his eyes as he checked for injuries. The man's pulse fluttered weakly, but he was alive. Miraculously, impossibly alive after all this time. Shade licked the hiker's face, tail thumping. The man managed a trembling smile, reaching out to touch the dog's head as if confirming he wasn't dreaming. Dane stabilized him as best he could, wrapping him in what was left of the emergency blanket and offering sips of water from his canteen. His mind raced through first aid training, check for shock, treat for hypothermia, keep him talking. "Caleb?" Dane asked, remembering the ID. The man nodded, eyes shining with disbelief. "Thought I was done for. Saw the dog, but I thought, just a ghost." "You're not seeing things," Dane said softly. "He brought me here. He saved us both." As Dane worked, he noticed Shade pawing through the snow a few feet away. There, buried beneath a thin crust of ice, was his own radio. Lost in the fall, but not beyond recovery. With trembling hands, Dane retrieved it, checked the battery, and managed to call in a new, urgent update. "We've found the missing hiker. He's alive. Repeat, alive. Request immediate medevac." The voice on the other end was quick and clear this time. "Roger that, Ranger. Extraction team inbound. ETA 10 minutes. Stay put. Keep patient warm." Dane let out a shaky laugh, the tension in his body beginning to dissolve. He looked at Shade, who had settled between the two men, keeping vigil with a calm that seemed to radiate safety and hope. Minutes stretched. Dane focused on keeping Caleb awake, asking him questions. What year it was, where he was from, who Shade was to him. Caleb's answers came slowly, sometimes fading into confusion, but it was enough. Each word, each breath was a small miracle. Above, the distant thrum of a helicopter finally sliced through the stillness. Dane waved the radio, signaling their position. The chopper circled and hovered, sending snow and debris swirling in a wild dance as rescue personnel rappelled down, medics shouting instructions and moving with brisk precision. One of the paramedics knelt beside Caleb, checking vitals and securing him to a stretcher. Another, pausing to catch his breath, glanced at Shade with surprise. "That collie, he used to belong to the missing hiker, right? Folks in town said the dog wouldn't leave the ridge. Heard stories he saved his owner after a fall once before." Dane met the medic's eyes, emotion choking him. "He saved us both this time," and, within minutes, Caleb was lifted toward safety, bundled in blankets and medical gear. The team moved to help Dane, securing his leg and preparing him for the ride. Shade watched it all, solemn and still, the very image of loyalty. Before Dane was lifted into the helicopter, he reached for Shade, burying his fingers in the collie's ruff. "Don't go, boy," he whispered. "You're family now." Shade pressed close, eyes shining, as if promising he would never leave again. As the rotors thundered overhead and the ground fell away, Dane looked down at the snow-covered ridge, the collapsed outcrop, the lonely forest, and the single dog who had turned a tale of loss into one of salvation. The mystery had been solved, but something deeper had been healed. As the world grew small beneath the chopper, Dane realized that survival, at its core, was a matter of connection, that no one, not even the lost, had to be alone forever. Days later, Millstone Ridge was almost unrecognizable under the gentle hush of early winter. Fresh snow had softened the jagged scars left by the storm, erasing most signs of chaos. What remained was a landscape returned to stillness. Pines heavy with white, animal tracks threading through drifts, and the sharp, clear air of a world quietly recovering. Dane Atwood sat on the porch of his ranger cabin, wrapped in a thick blanket and sipping carefully at a mug of strong coffee. His leg was in a cast and propped on a crate, his body still aching, but slowly healing from the ordeal. It was strange, he thought, how quickly life could tilt from terror to calm, from the edge of death to this moment of rare peace. Beside him, pressed close for warmth and companionship, sat Shade. The collie had barely left his side since they'd been airlifted out of the woods, except for the few hours spent pacing nervously outside the medical tent while Dane received treatment. Now, reunited, they watched the sun rise together, the world turning gold on the ridge where their story had begun. News of the rescue had spread quickly. Caleb Watterson, the lost hiker, was recovering in the hospital, slowly regaining strength. His family and the entire town visiting in waves, eager to witness a miracle in the flesh. Caleb's story and Shade's role in it became local legend, retold in grocery store aisles and coffee shops, drawing reporters and curious travelers alike to the quiet corners of the Great Smoky Mountains. Dane tried to avoid the spotlight. He attended the debriefs, gave interviews when asked, but mostly kept to himself, grateful for the quiet after so much noise. What mattered more than any news story was the simple fact that both he and Caleb were alive, and that the bond with Shade had become something he could no longer deny or dismiss as chance. As the days slipped by, Dane found himself thinking back on everything that had brought him here, every loss, every moment of doubt, every time he'd nearly given up. Atlanta felt like a different life. His old pain, the sting of betrayal and exile, had not disappeared, but it no longer ruled him. Instead, it was something he could hold at arm's length. Understood, but no longer consuming. Shade was a big part of that healing. The collie seemed to sense Dane's shifting mood, sometimes lying quietly beside him, other times nudging him outside for short walks along the snowy trails. People in town asked if Dane would return the dog to Caleb, but the answer was always gentle and clear. Caleb himself had insisted that Shade had found his new home. "He needs you now more than me," Caleb had said, hugging the dog goodbye, tears in his eyes. Take care of each other. So they did. Their days were simple but full. Mornings spent watching the sun rise, afternoons mending gear or shoveling snow, evenings sharing a fire's warmth. Dane spoke to Shade constantly, voicing his thoughts and fears, sharing memories of his old life and hopes for the new one. He found that speaking them aloud, even just to a dog, made them lighter. Sometimes he still woke in the night, heart pounding with old fears or dreams of loss. In those moments, Shade would be there, silent, patient, a steady anchor in the darkness. Dane would reach out, tangle his fingers in thick fur, and remember that survival was about more than escaping danger. It was about finding a place and a companion where you could finally stop running. Winter passed slowly, bringing with it visitors from the Park Service, townsfolk with hot meals and gifts, even children who wanted to meet the famous dog. Shade greeted everyone with quiet dignity, but always returned to Dane's side, as if certain their bond was the real miracle in the story. One afternoon, as the sky faded to dusk, Dane sat with Shade on the porch and watched the shadows grow long across Millstone Ridge. He thought of all he'd lost, but also of all he'd gained. A sense of belonging not found in city offices or headlines, but in the hush of wild places and the companionship of a loyal soul. He reached down, scratching Shade behind the ears. The dog sighed contentedly, pressing closer. "You know, boy, I used to think the wild had left me behind, that I'd been exiled for good," Dane murmured. "But maybe it was just waiting. Maybe it was waiting for me to stop abandoning myself." As Shade looked up, eyes bright and knowing. In that moment, Dane understood what true homecoming felt like. A release of guilt, a quiet forgiveness, the peace that comes when you finally accept your place in the world. The next morning, Dane woke to the soft sound of birdsong and the warm press of Shade against his side. A new day, a new beginning. He felt lighter, unburdened, and, most of all, grateful. Looking out across the ridge, he smiled and spoke quietly, knowing Shade was listening. Let's keep telling stories that matter, boy. Yeah, let's make every day count. He stood, wincing but determined, and together they set out into the snowy woods, side by side, ready to face whatever the mountains held for them next. Underscore, 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 underscore. Maybe the wild didn't abandon me. Maybe it was just waiting for me to stop abandoning myself. If the story moved you, give it a like and follow the channel. Let's keep telling stories that matter.